after its launch in November of 2006. One of the biggest criticisms, its price aside, of Sony's latest console, the PlayStation 3, was its lack of games. Because of its unique architecture, developers had trouble making games for it. This led to the console launching with less than 20 games during its launch window. While there were good games among them, there were just as many that weren't, and none of the games did anything to justify the console's large price tag to most. However, despite the game drought during year one, there were still promising titles in development. One of those was a dark fantasy game originally revealed at Sony's now infamous 2006 E3 press conference. Today, we'll be taking a look at one of the most interesting games to be released on the PlayStation 3, Folklore. While Yoshiki Okamoto would eventually become one of Japan's most influential game designers, at the start of his career, he didn't really like games that much. He was an artist and wanted the opportunity to creatively express himself. Originally, when I joined Konami, I didn't even know Konami was a game company. I was hired as an illustrator. Then my boss told me to create a traffic school game, and I thought, I don't want to do this. If I have to make a game, I want to make one that I would actually like myself. Up to that point, I didn't even like games at all. I just wanted to make a game that someone like me would want to play. So I made that game, Time Pilot, and things actually turned out well. Then they asked me to make another one. I don't want to make games, I told them. But fine, I will make another one. But after that, I want to make a poster. I mean, I was hired as an illustrator, and that's what I was hoping I could do there. So they said I could work on a poster when the game Geras was finished. But after it was done, they didn't keep their promise. They wanted me to continue to make more games. That's when I quit working at Konami. Then I went to Capcom. I figured, well, this is another game company, and I'm here now. So I guess I might as well get to work creating some games. But now I love games. I mean, I really love them. Since joining the company in 1983, he helped to create some of the most popular and influential games of the late 1990s, like Final Fight, Street Fighter II, and Resident Evil. After all of his success, in 1997, 1 year after the release of Resident Evil, he decided to leave Capcom to form his own independent studio, Flagship. But while Flagship was technically an independent game studio, all of its funding was provided by 3 large game companies, Capcom, Nintendo, and Sega. So while he didn't work for them officially, he would continue making games for Capcom, as well as Nintendo and Sega, at this new studio. Flagship was known for their scenario writing, and that, combined with their development capabilities, allowed them to work on a wide variety of games for a variety of different consoles. They were scenario writers for Capcom, writing for games like Dino Crisis 2 and 3, the first 3 single-player Onimusha games, and various Resident Evil games, including Resident Evil 2, Code Veronica, and Zero. They showcased their skills as developers for Nintendo, working on several games for their handheld systems, such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and Four Swords, and The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. However, despite all of Flagship's success, Okamoto was ready for a change. While he had already made up his mind to strike out on his own, it wasn't an easy decision to stop working for the company where he had spent most of his career. While he didn't have any large issues with Capcom, there were several small things that bothered him. One of those was a disagreement about the direction the company was headed in, and another was all of the restrictions he had to deal with as a company executive. In an interview with 1UP, he explained how he came to the decision to leave Capcom. It was all about creative freedom. I was partially responsible for making the company what it was, and I felt that Capcom was reaching a point where it would have to become conservative. But I didn't want to be conservative. My heart just wasn't into that. I was thinking about this a lot, and one day it dawned on me that perhaps the best solution was just to leave. I was at the top of the company pyramid, and I figured this might also shake things up and make way for some younger people to move up. I felt like I was the lid, and if I left, it would open up the company again. His mind made up. All he had to do now was actually quit, but it wasn't easy for him. When I decided I was going to quit, it was with absolute certainty. I drank so much one night that I don't even remember what happened exactly, but my decision was made. I was carried to my bed with my clothes still on. The reason I did that is because it was almost like dying. That's how difficult it was for me and how strong I felt about it. I wanted to die and then be reborn. After I made my decision to leave Capcom, I went straight to the president and kept asking, let me quit, let me quit. But he said, no, you have to think about this some more. You can't leave. He even offered me a huge boost in my salary so I wouldn't go to another company. And that was way more than any other employee in the company was getting. It was probably the most amount of money that he could technically even offer. At that point, I didn't want to embarrass him, so I asked to think about it. But of course, my decision wasn't influenced at all. So after a while, I returned to him and said, I've thought about it, but I can't accept this raise. I have to quit and start my own thing. That's how I left Capcom. And on June 20th, 2003, he left Capcom after 19 years and 9 months. He immediately got to work, founding his new independent game studio on July 1st of that same year. The name of the studio started off as Okatuku, but the name was eventually changed to Game Republic. One of the reasons that he felt comfortable starting so soon, and without securing funding, is because of the money that he had saved up during the course of his career. While he didn't leave Capcom until 2003, that wasn't the first time that he considered quitting. Several years prior, he had told his boss that he wanted to quit, but he was convinced to stay. In order to do so, Capcom offered him a new job title and an increase in his salary. With all of the pay raises that he would eventually receive over time, he had made quite a bit of money. News of his departure from Capcom sent ripples throughout the game industry. And because of his reputation, he didn't have trouble finding people willing to help fund his next project. However, he had set 2 rules for himself. He didn't want to work on the same kind of games that he had already made at Capcom, and he didn't want to work for any of Capcom's direct competitors. Unfortunately, that severely limited his options. When a company approaches us to do work, they'll always say something like, let's make a game where you shoot zombies, like horror franchise Resident Evil, or let's make a fighting game like Street Fighter. In essence, something related to what I've done in the past. I actively avoided those games, and that's the reason I had a tough time in the beginning. I didn't have many jobs because I kept turning those offers down. I really didn't want people to think like that, so I actively stayed away from any Capcom sort of stuff. His plan was to use a part of his savings to jumpstart the company. He tried to recruit developers who would be willing to work with him in exchange for stock in the company, and the company wouldn't be listed on the stock market in order to avoid outside influence. He didn't want to have a public relations or sales division within the company, so if things went according to plan, most of the employees would be developers. And since they were a new company that didn't exactly have projects lined up, they would initially focus on working with other companies. However, even with his years of experience in the game industry, the early years of Game Republic were very difficult. In the beginning, I was worried about whether I'd be able to really build a staff, create new jobs, raise enough money, open a bank account, or basically start an office. There were lots of things I was worried about. In the beginning, I had an apartment in Inoshima, which is near the beach, so I gathered up 18 people in my place, and we started talking about what types of games we wanted to make. After I left there, I rented an apartment in Jiyugaoka and made that my main office. There was a woman who lived in that room who would put away the futons and go to work, and then we would pull out our desks and make that our office. That's how we started out. We would work every day until about 2 a.m. and then go fishing. What we caught was our breakfast. Coincidentally, that summer was a cold summer, so there wasn't much need for air conditioners. If it had been a normal summer, it would have been unbearable with 18 of us crammed into one apartment. But it was a cold summer, so we survived. I'll admit it was very tough for us though. We were really on the edge, but we made it through. Even though things were tough, this wasn't unexpected. From the very beginning, the executives of Game Republic knew that the first few years would be rough, but they had a 9-year plan for future sustained success. From the beginning, we planned for the first 3 years to be a time to focus mainly on growing the company, to increase the number of people working for us and the scale of the company in general. This meant having to hire a lot of young employees, many of whom lacked experience in the industry. They might not be ready to form development teams, but we needed them nonetheless. Like, we might lack scenario planners, but we have an opportunity to hire programmers, and we had to go for it. Our goal was to try and hire anybody we thought could be of use in the future, and that's really taken these first 3 years. During the next 3, the aim is to really improve the quality of the products we turn out, to really succeed in this regard. Like, if we can get people to invest in our company now, and we work hard at this, then by years 4, 5, and 6, we'll start being able to make quality games. In the 7th, 8th, and 9th years, the goal will be maintaining that quality. The human resources we've gathered by that point will allow us to start cutting our operating costs. It's generally understood in the Japanese market today that a company can start producing interesting games in its 4th, 5th, and 6th years, but still not turn much of a profit. The company is supposed to start making money in years 7 through 9, and then those profits can be shared by all the employees, so it's sort of a 9-year plan we're on. Okamoto thought it was the perfect time to start his own studio. That was because he knew that next generation consoles were right around the corner. If he was going to get the opportunity to work with any of the major console manufacturers on a new project, this would probably be his new studio's best chance. Being able to secure a deal with Sony, Microsoft, and/or Nintendo at the beginning of a new console generation would not only be lucrative, but it would allow Game Republic to make games without violating the 2 rules that he implemented. The fledgling studio got to work, and they eventually got in contact with both Microsoft and Sony. They pitched them initial concepts, and once they got the go-ahead, they started developing them to showcase how they would work. And not too long after the studio had opened, they would be developing games for not just 1, but 2 console manufacturers. In September of 2004, Sony announced 2 games for the PlayStation 2, Wanda and the Giant, and Genji. Not much was known about Genji other than its setting, which was ancient Japan, and its curious developer, Game Republic. Many people had been anticipating Game Republic's first game, and they would get to see more of it later that month at the Tokyo Game Show. In addition to the work on Genji, Game Republic was also planning on working with Sony on future titles. During the development of Genji, Game Republic started working on 2 projects for the next console generation, a sequel to Genji and what would become Folklore. The event that I remember most is when we were working on Genji on PS2, and development kits had begun for the PlayStation 3. With Genji, we felt its beauty was in its graphics, and the first title really took advantage of the PS2's hardware. Because we felt Genji was a good title to develop for the PS3, we asked Sony if we could make a sequel for the next-gen hardware, and to hit the launch window. That was the goal that Game Republic had when pitching this idea. At the same time this was going on, we were developing Folklore. which was separate from the Genji team and was also being made for the PlayStation 2. But we all felt the game would also benefit from being released on the PlayStation 3 instead. When we asked Sony if we could do this as well, I remember when Sony said, "Sure, you can make Folklore for the PS3." That was the most memorable moment, and a pivotal point for the game's production. During this same time, Gaia was working on a monster collection game for the PlayStation Portable, and it would be titled Monster Kingdom Jewel Summoner. Game Republic's project that they had pitched to Sony while they were still developing Genji Dawn of the Samurai was going to be a sequel to Jewel Summoner on Sony's new, more powerful next-gen console. The title for this new project was Monster Kingdom. As production continued, in March of 2005, Microsoft announced that it would be working with Game Republic to produce an unannounced number of exclusive games for the next iteration of the Xbox console. However, shortly after the announcement, Okamoto revealed that Game Republic was working on 2 games for the next generation Xbox. And the next month, Okamoto revealed that Game Republic was currently working on 6 different games. The only game that was officially announced was Genji, and they were the 2 games that they were developing for Microsoft. That left 3 games completely unaccounted for. In June, one of the games for Microsoft was revealed. The game was called Every Party, and like the name suggested, it was a party game. As you could guess from the title, Every Party is a party game for everybody. Up until now, I was probably known for games that involved punching, kicking, slashing, shooting, and killing. But this is going to be a party game intended for all ages, so there will be no violence or grotesque scenes. I was asked by people as to why I'm making a party game for a next generation machine, and whether it really meets the specs of next generation hardware. But that's not what games are all about. Even nowadays, people play old time games such as Famicoms. Games are simply supposed to be fun. 2 of those games have been in the works for a while. As mentioned previously, Game Republic started development on 2 games while they were still working on Genji Dawn of the Samurai, a next-gen sequel to Genji, and Monster Kingdom. The remaining 2 games were Brave Story New Traveler, a role-playing game for the PlayStation Portable, and the other game for the next generation Xbox, which was ultimately cancelled. I was working with Microsoft Japan, and they wanted 2 different titles from us for the Japanese market by launch. In the beginning, we were working on the 2 titles, but one of them went away. The remaining title was Every Party. The other title is gone for good. In the beginning, Microsoft was funding it, so we developed it up to a point and showed it to them. They said they didn't really like it that much. After that, we continued to develop the game with our own money for 9 more months, thinking that they'd come around. But when we showed it to Microsoft again, they said they didn't need titles for the Japanese market anymore. That's why the game ultimately got cancelled. Later that year, Genji Dawn of the Samurai was finally released. It arrived on store shelves on June 30th in Japan, September 20th in North America, and October 21st in Europe. Unfortunately for Game Republic, while the game had its fans, reviews of the game were mixed. It was praised for its visuals, its take on the epic sword that inspired it, the Tale of the Heike, and how accessible it was for new players. However, it was criticized for its short length, shallow gameplay, and lack of originality. Since Genji Dawn of the Samurai was an action game, and Game Republic was its developer, comparisons to action games that Yoshiki Okamoto previously worked on was inevitable.
He slices, he dices, he dances. There's something familiar about this. Oh, that's what it is. Sometimes Genji forgets that it's not an Onimusha game.
Genji was constantly compared, often unfavorably, to Onimusha. Some people at Capcom had even voiced their displeasure at seeing an employee leave the company to create an Onimusha clone. Okamoto understood why the comparisons were being made, but he disagreed with the notion that Genji is just his attempt to recreate Onimusha. If you've actually played Genji, it's not an Onimusha clone. Sure, if you look at the screenshots, it may seem like Onimusha because of the atmosphere and since the character has a sword, but the similarities really end there. I don't want people to think that I set out to create an Onimusha ripoff or anything like what I did for Capcom. I've been trying to stay away from all that stuff. With Genji Dawn of the Samurai released, Game Republic could focus all of its efforts on developing for the next generation of consoles. The Genji team could focus on Dawn of the Samurai sequel, Genji Days of the Blade, and the other teams could all focus on their respective projects. According to the game's director Takashi Shono, the genesis of the Monster Kingdom project came from several people. First of all, this project started with all the main staff coming up with ideas, not only directors and planners, but also designers, programmers, and other section staff. Not all Game Republic titles have that launch, but this time around, we had a unique staff with interesting ideas, and I was able to come up with the 2 big themes at a relatively early stage. One is a fantasy game that adults can enjoy, and the other is overturning the existing view of fantasy, creating a unique expression. When creating the game's narrative, the underlying theme that they decided to focus on was what is the afterlife. While most people probably have an idea of what they think an afterlife may look like, it's not like there's someone around to give you a detailed description. This allowed them to get creative with their reimagining of this alternative world. Yoshiki Okamoto got a lot of his ideas for the game from Irish folklore. However, because of how popular some of those themes are, he wanted to stick very closely to the original stories. This would ensure that the game's design was original, and that people wouldn't assume that it's something like Lord of the Rings. The game's genre was always described as a dark fantasy by the developers, but even amongst themselves, there wasn't a consensus on what dark fantasy actually meant. Nailing that down was an important part of finalizing the game's art direction. When the leader of the art department was describing the game's world, they weren't picturing a high fantasy world with darker themes, but American horror novels. They were describing worlds that may have been created by Stephen King, Ray Bradbury, or Edgar Allan Poe. I use the term dark fantasy to explain the worldview that horror and supernatural appear and disappear between stories going on the stage in the real world. Another point of contention within the art team was trying to balance realistic and fantastic elements in their design. When they were eventually able to agree on a unified way to express those two elements, the team was proud of what they were able to achieve and thought that its aesthetic was something unique both to the PlayStation 3 and the game itself. One of the most interesting aspects of the game's narrative is the way that it's told. When designing the main scenario, writers had to find a way to balance storytelling with the game's action-oriented gameplay. In order to accomplish this, they would break up events into smaller pieces and try to utilize environmental storytelling whenever possible. One of the methods that they used to accomplish this, as well as to add to the narrative's mystery, was to have two main characters with separate but interconnected stories. Each character would have different experiences with the same events, characters, and locations, which would help to flesh out the world and answer some of the players' questions. Game Republic decided to present the game's narrative in 3 different ways: pre-rendered cutscenes, in-game cutscenes, and what they call comic demos. By the way, this comic demo, the characters used in the game are placed in the divided screen. It is a unique system devised for this work, which is to read the story as if reading a manga or comic. With that in mind, I thought of a heavy and complicated plot of a full-scale mystery novel. Comic demos are used as a form that is as easy to understand as possible, in order to grasp the complicated hints in intricate human relationships. With that being said, they were worried that it would be difficult for the comic demos to stand up to the rest of the game's visuals. However, since they thought they were, essentially, reusing existing visual elements, that they would be able to create interesting images. The biggest challenges that they faced were creating images with a 3D character model and a 2D background, and having to change various aspects of the composition, like lighting for example, from the main game. The 2 previously mentioned main characters were named Ellen and Keats, according to the lead character art designer. The idea for the dual storylines may have been inspired by the game's 2 worlds, but admittedly, he isn't sure. In Ellen's original design, she was supposed to be a monster, inspired by the Kuchisake Onna and Hanako-san from Japanese folklore. The Kuchisake Onna is the evil spirit of a woman who asks people if they think that she's beautiful. If they say no, she kills them, and if they say yes, she will reveal that her mouth has been cut from ear to ear and ask the question again. And Hanako-san is the spirit of a young girl who haunts school toilets. While these initial ideas were eventually abandoned, they still wanted the character to be mysterious. Being easy to get rumors requires a feature that anyone can explain in one word. Also, when it comes to the existence of rumors, that point will be exaggerated more and more. That's why I wanted Ellen to have some extreme characteristics. So at first, it was a girl wearing a black coat and a hat even deeply in the summer. I thought it would be nice to have an urban legend, to wear raincoats and boots even though it was sunny. However, there was an opinion that if you were too gloomy and your face was hidden, you wouldn't feel like a heroine, and that's the best. So it's been a long time since then to balance cuteness and mysterious feeling. As a result of having the character designer draw a number of designs from the face to the clothes, I settled on Ellen as she is now. Since it took them a while to finalize Keats' role in the story, they started off by crafting his image and personality. One of the characters that inspired his design was Fox Mulder from the X-Files, and they tried to add some of his eccentricity to Keats. The image of a rugged head on the glasses came from a setting that was a little eccentric, like the character Mulder. As for his personality, he was asked to proceed with the image of a high-pressure man who says something a little silly with an arrogant attitude to Ellen, who says only unscientific things. In order to reflect the 2 different perspectives that the player would experience the story through, the gameplay would have to be distinctive as well. Ellen and Keats, who had different experiences and personalities, would each have their own strengths and weaknesses. While it was primarily an action game, Monster Kingdom would have Monster Collection gameplay similar to that of its prequel, Monster Kingdom Jewel Summoner. While the developers were enthusiastic about having 2 different playstyles, this ended up causing them a lot of trouble. Simply put, in a standard action game, you can build patterns of attack animations for the main character and string them together to create action. But the action in this game was based on monsters, or folk, that you would be capturing. In other words, the number of folks appearing as enemies equaled the number that the 2 main characters can use and the number of action patterns holds, which requires a huge amount of design data and action patterns. Moreover, the concept of let's make a difference in action between Keats and Ellen is unwavering, so it has become really difficult. That's why I really had a hard time building a lot of action patterns for both Keats and Ellen, and specifications for creating design data, and the design staff who produced a huge amount of data. After all that was finished, the question became, How exactly are we going to make each character feel different when the core gameplay is the same? They decided to make each character fight using very distinct styles. Ellen wouldn't be able to use any physical attacks and would have to deal damage in other ways, while Keats would thrive in close quarters combat. So how do you make the user feel different actions with the controls that feel the same? Keats finally uses folks, who are good at continuous attacks and powerful single-shot attacks, and Ellen is a trap for actions that emphasize good tempo and exhilaration. As such, she can affect multiple bodies simultaneously by using folks with causative features. I settled on the direction of a puzzle-like feeling of doing, and a fun action that overwhelms the enemy with effort. For example, in the case of Keats, you can use many folks who are good at continuous attacks or combos to attack at a good tempo, and use powerful attacks such as Dragon that spits ice breath and Demon that shoots a ball of fire. You can enjoy the exhilaration of defeating enemies by using the folks who have a single attack. In the case of Ellen, she uses traps such as stationary bombs and traps that block the movement of enemies, and folks that are good at accumulation attacks. You can feel it, trying to overwhelm your enemies in a fight by using folks, which attack multiple enemies at the same time, and enjoy various changes depending on how you fight. As such, the two protagonists can now enjoy a completely different sense of action while maintaining the same sense of operation as the concept. With how critical they are to the gameplay, folks were, obviously, going to be something that they spent a lot of time working on. The game was going to feature more than 100 unique creatures that the player would be able to capture and battle against. The most difficult part about developing the folks was correctly adjusting the parameters for this large number of characters. They wanted players to be able to quickly shift between different folks that they captured, so they allowed you to map them to different buttons. Considering handling more than 100 folks, it seemed difficult to operate, but in the end, I decided to allocate it to 4 buttons. This allows the player to freely choose a folk and place it on the button. You can now create your own playstyle. Game Republic wanted the game to be accessible to people who weren't very good at action games, as well as hardcore fans of the genre. In order to do this, they wanted to make the difficulty of the game easy to adjust, as well as give players different ways of progressing through the game. Even those who are not good at action games can enjoy it. Of course, we are also waiting for super powerful guys who will satisfy the skillful action gamers. There are innumerable ways to adjust the difficulty level, changing the attack force, changing the frequency of attack, etc. Exploring other worlds and absorbing various folk ids will increase the means of attack and defense, and folks will be strengthened by repeated battles and collecting items. You can also strengthen yourself by RPG-like means as it will be done. You can strengthen yourself and defeat powerful enemies in a dynamic manner, or you can defeat them by brilliantly avoiding attacks without powering up. You can find a clue to this strategy with a playstyle that suits you. As mentioned earlier, Monster Kingdom was far from the only game in development at Game Republic, and in 2006, one of the studio's most important projects was the sequel to their PlayStation 2 action game Genji. While Sony had confirmed that a sequel to Genji Dawn of the Samurai was in development back in 2005, people wouldn't get their first real look at the game until their press conference at E3 on May 9, 2006. And even then, it was only known as Genji 2. Its official title wouldn't be revealed until August, when the title was changed to Genji Days of the Blade. The day before Genji Days of the Blade was showcased at E3, people got their first glimpse of Monster Kingdom with a short trailer at Sony's press conference. And in the month before Genji Days of the Blade was set to release, more information about the game was revealed, and some of it was changed. And on September 6th, its name was changed from Monster Kingdom to Unknown Realms. While the game was supposed to be a sequel to Monster Kingdom Jewel Summoner, after its poor sales numbers when it was released in Japan on February 23, 2006, it appears as if Sony decided to sever the connection between the two games. When Genji Days of the Blade was released in November of 2006, it received an even worse response from critics than its predecessor. While most people thought that it was a great showcase of the PlayStation 3's graphical capabilities, the game's camera, repetitive gameplay, and lack of original ideas contributed to its poor reception. But this was the first game that Game Republic had made for the PlayStation 3, and there were a lot of lessons that they learned from Days of the Blade that they could implement in Unknown Realms. Fortunately for the studio, they had time to make changes, because as of September 2006, only about 30% of Unknown Realms have been completed. The first thing they could address was the most glaring issue in Genji Days of the Blade, its camera. They decided to pull the camera much further back in Unknown Realms, which not only showcased the game's visuals, but also provide the player with a better view of the battlefield. Since both projects had started off as games for the PlayStation 2, the respective teams tried to reuse assets from that period of development, Unfortunately for both games, it turned out that these assets wouldn't be suitable for gaming on next-gen hardware. As it turned out, we had to start again from zero. We had to work on it all over again from scratch and reuse old models and recreate the stages because everything from the PlayStation 2 we couldn't use, and the SIXAXIS added more challenges to them. So we had to throw everything out and start all over again. The SIXAXIS was the name of the first iteration of the PlayStation 3's controller, and it would cause the developers at Game Republic headaches during the course of development for each game. In Genji Days of the Blade, they weren't fully able to utilize the controller's features because they weren't available soon enough. Obviously, you lose something without the rumble. The game design was not thought out with the SIXAXIS in mind. In Unknown Realms' case, the SIXAXIS' features, or lack thereof, had a large impact on how the game was developed. When they started designing the process of capturing folk, they initially used standard button inputs, but it never came together like they wanted it to. One of the missions behind the game is defeating the folks and capturing the folks and pulling their souls, or ids, out, and that has to feel good to the players while they're doing it. Initially, in the very beginning, the SIXAXIS wasn't actually included in the PlayStation 3 development kit. It came a little bit afterwards, so we worked on ways to make the gameplay fun using a different kind of control design. When we implemented this, however, it didn't quite feel right, and we didn't think that people would enjoy playing the game in this way. But when the SIXAXIS came along, we thought, yes, this fits in perfectly with the concept of the game. So at that point, we changed certain elements of the control and programming to adopt the motion sensing technology. While they were reworking the folk capturing process, they had to come up with a way to showcase the controller's motion sensing features in a way that was easy for players to understand. In order to accomplish this, there were 3 things that they kept in mind during the course of its development. 1. Simple operability that is intuitive and easy to understand even for someone using the SIXAXIS for the first time. 2. A sense of unity linked to the movement of the id on the screen. 3. A sense of accomplishment obtained when the id is absorbed. Controls feel good and can let you see that you have improved. They developed the various methods of capturing the folk's id by constantly creating new capture patterns and iterating on them. They created 6 different ways that ids could be absorbed, and the patterns changed depending on the folk that you were trying to capture. To make each pattern easily distinguishable by the player, they were each given their own color and movement patterns. They had been able to adapt to the situation and rework the game's mechanics around the additional features of the SIXAXIS. But Sony wasn't done iterating on the controller's design, and while these changes may have resulted in a better controller, it didn't give developers a lot of time to utilize the new features. The SIXAXIS didn't have rumble functionality while we were working on the game, but then, shortly after we released it, the DualShock 3 came out with both rumble and motion sensitivity. Until then, we'd been assured the controller would never have rumble. If we'd known from the start that rumble would be possible, it would have affected the development process. The controller would have shaken when you got hit during battle, or rattled if you stepped into a trap, and then quit as soon as you got yourself out of it. There are all sorts of things we could have added in, but we were told we'd only have the SIXAXIS, so those ideas got left out. As development on the game continued, things were quiet and interested fans didn't receive much news about its progress, but on March 23, 2007, the game's name changed once more. The latest title for this project was Folk Soul Ushino Warita Densho, or Folk Soul The Lost Folklore in English, and its Japanese release was scheduled for June of that same year. Shortly afterwards, on May 16th, an English trailer was released. The trailer revealed the game's English name, Folklore, and that it would be released during the fall. At E3 in July, the game was impressive, and it took home IGN's Best of E3 award for Best RPG. The North American release date was also reported to be on October 2nd, but it was eventually pushed back a week to October 9th. Folklore was eventually released on June 21st in Japan, October 9th in North America, October 12th in Europe, and October 18th in Australia. Its reception from critics was generally positive, but it was a bit polarizing. While many reviewers praised the game's narrative, atmosphere, originality, and visuals, it was criticized for its linearity, pacing, and for feeling unpolished. And critics were split on whether its gameplay was excellent in its variety and simplicity, or boring due to a lack of mechanical depth. The game would take advantage of the PlayStation Network. The downloadable content included additional costumes, quests, and folk to collect. The first pack of DLC, Kidnapped Folk, was released on October 25, 2007, shortly after the game's release. The final piece of DLC, the Malian Pack, was released on February 7, 2008. However, 2 add-ons, the Malian Pack and the Pigly Pack, were only released in Europe. Initially, things looked promising for Folklore. While it didn't receive universal acclaim from everyone who played it, it was a good game, and there was a lot that could be built upon in future installments. Shortly after its release in Japan, Sony's Bill Rich said that, "We've got a PSP version of Folklore, and Kenji Okada is working on that." Kenji Okada is one of the co-creators of the Shin Megami Tensei series, so this had the potential to be an incredibly interesting title for Sony's handheld. Unfortunately, none of this would come to be. In an interview with 1UP in December 2008, Yoshiki Okamoto delivered the news that Folklore would remain a singular game, without the possibility of future installments. Unfortunately, we're not making a sequel. We had talked about a PSP version for Folklore, but we've since ceased those discussions. It makes me a little sad, but that's just the way it is. While we wouldn't get a sequel to Folklore, that doesn't mean that they didn't try. In 2011, according to NeoGAF user Kuronika, who was reported to be a former employee of Game Republic, they pitched a sequel that would take advantage of the PlayStation 3's latest peripheral, the PlayStation Move. Apparently, the pitch was actually received rather well by Sony, but it failed its internal review by a few points. For those of you looking for a sequel to Folklore, all I can say is don't hold your breath. The IP lies in Sony's hands, and by their accounts, Folklore was a failure. News of the potential sequel was uncovered at the same time the studio behind it had just gone under. In June of 2011, after being in business for 8 years and creating 15 games on 5 consoles, Game Republic closed its doors for the last time. Okamoto would take the blame for the closing of the studio, stating that, "It came down to my lack of communication, how I built relationships and communicated with people both inside and outside the company. Several decisions were made during the life of the studio that, in retrospect, may have contributed to its collapse. But the biggest mistake was agreeing to partner with Brash Entertainment, a publisher that wanted to exclusively publish licensed games in 2007.
We made a deal with a number of different studios, and I think the idea is, for us anyway, not all movies need to be made into games. That's a pretty bad idea. The idea is to take things that are compelling and that we think will translate, just like you would a graphic novel or a television show or anything that's got great characters and a story, and to try and, go ahead and make great games based on those properties.
They were hired to create a video game adaptation of the upcoming film Clash of the Titans, and another game, 301. That would be a sequel to the movie 300. Unfortunately for Game Republic, Brash Entertainment went out of business the very next year, in November of 2008, despite Clash of the Titans' development. This event sealed the studio's fate. We were working on milestones, and after the milestones got approved, we were supposed to get paid. But Brash didn't have the money, and that turned into debt. It cost us about $2 million to run the company each month, and that added up over time. Brash Entertainment's collapse resulted in several studios closing their doors, but according to a former anonymous employee of the publisher, the studios bear some of the responsibility for their financial situations. That's somewhat Brash's fault, but it's also the developer's fault for not having other options. If you're too dependent on a brand new publisher with speculative funding, well, you're taking some risk. A developer's only as good as the deals they can get, so if they had a better deal with EA, then they wouldn't have been talking to us in the first place. Game Republic, unlike many other studios involved with Brash Entertainment, managed to survive for a few more years and make a few more games. While Clash of the Titans was picked up by Namco Bandai and was eventually released in 2010, the damage had already been done. The debt that the company racked up wasn't helped by the studio's inability to create a commercially successful game. Part of this was definitely because of the quality of the games themselves. Out of all of the games that Game Republic released outside of Japan, only 3 of them have received generally favorable reviews on review aggregator Metacritic. Their average Metacritic score was an uninspiring 63, with their most highly reviewed game being Dragon Ball Origins for the Nintendo DS, which received a 78 out of 100. A good chunk of the games that they released just weren't very good, and this is something that Okamoto admitted in an interview with Gamasutra in 2008. When asked to give an honest assessment of the games that his studio had released at the time, he said, "As unfortunate as it is, I haven't been happy with them at all. I feel like in each case, something's prevented us from putting what I'd consider to be the final touches on the games. A lot of the games we've made so far have been launch titles. Whenever you're trying to get a game finished to coincide with a console launch, you're bound to run into a few development snags, and you'll always wish you had a little more time. These companies we were indebted to needed someone to be a part of that first bloody charge though, so I was like, okay, we'll do it." Even Folklore, the game that, along with Genji Dawn of the Samurai, the studio is probably most well known for, wasn't satisfactory. There were a number of problems with the timing of the release, so no, I wasn't that satisfied with how it turned out. This might be me being selfish, but I really wish we had more time for development. While Game Republic definitely had some challenges to overcome, constantly developing launch titles, short development cycles, and publishers folding underneath them, to name a few. For various reasons, both those in and outside of their control, the company's games just didn't sell well enough for them to be profitable. Clash of the Titans, for example, sold less than 40% of its projected sales during its first 3 months on the market, and when the company finally closed, it was about $10 million in debt. Unfortunately, the chances of Sony reviving an intellectual property that was a commercial flop, and hasn't been relevant in more than a decade, is probably pretty close to zero. If there's one silver lining in all of this, it's that Folklore doesn't really need a sequel, even though there's certainly potential for more stories to be told in the world that it introduced us to, and room to further refine its gameplay. The story that it presented in 2007 was wrapped up rather nicely, and even if what we received then is all that we ever get, what we got was pretty good.